So, I've already talked about a few characters that have been cut from the Versus games before, but a series as big and as long-running as the Versus games are bound to have way more things that never left the cutting room floor. Some interesting developments have happened regarding certain characters between the last video and now, which I'll get into later. So, no long preamble from me here or anything. Here's a few more characters cut from the Capcom Versus games. Even going back to the very first game in the series, X-Men vs Street Fighter, there's some interesting choices made roster-wise, the most interesting of which is Cammy. Cammy herself was a fairly popular character from her debut in Super Street Fighter 2 onwards, so her being in this isn't the interesting part, but more so her design. Instead of the Delta Red operative we got in Super SF2, we instead get Cammy in an entirely new design depicting her stint as a Shadaloo operative under Bison. Something which at that point in time, had only ever been mentioned in canon in Cammy's new Challengers ending. Capcom went on to include Cammy as a secret bonus character in Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, which was a home conversion of the Japanese exclusive arcade update to the second Alpha game, Street Fighter 02 Alpha. She'd later show up in Street Fighter Alpha 3, where the plot starts giving some context for her time serving under Bison. As it turns out though, this apparently wasn't going to be the only time the Versus games planned to debut something new for a Street Fighter character. Hidden in the code of Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter lie unused sprites for one Miss Kaden Kanzuki, who as we know didn't make her playable debut until a year later in Street Fighter Alpha 3. She did however first appear in the Sakura Ganbaro manga, which chronicled Sakura's exploits within the time frame of the Alpha series. Her unused sprites reflect this as well. She's a head swap of Sakura, but notably has different footwear in line with her design from the manga. It's possible that she was going to initially play like Sakura too, and I feel like that might be a part of why they ended up scrapping her. Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter in general was put together in a shorter time frame and on a tighter budget than X-Men vs Street Fighter. A point I mentioned in a previous video talking about Symbiote Spider-Man being pitched for the same game. Maybe they didn't have the time to dedicate to working on her since she'd still be a bit more effort than a palette swap. Or maybe they felt that she deserved to have her own moveset to be fleshed out in the Street Fighter game proper. Whatever the case may be, she went on to become a pretty well received character in the Street Fighter games, so it's safe to say they made the right call. Marvel vs Capcom 1 had quite a few characters proposed for the game that didn't end up making the cut. Howard the Duck was a proposed character by some of the staff, but was denied by both Marvel and Capcom USA as well as other team members. Both Capcom and Marvel were well aware of how badly the Howard the Duck movie went down, and the development team wanted to step away from dedicated Joe characters after having Norimaro in the previous game. She-Hulk was also another character proposed for the game, and she would have broken the fourth wall the same way Deadpool does in Marvel vs Capcom 3, something She-Hulk lampshades herself in that game. One of the most interesting proposals for the game though was for its final boss, who, hilariously enough, also ended up being fully realized in Marvel 3.
Kneel before Galactus.
Katsuya Akitomo, a former Capcom staffer who helped familiarize the team with Marvel in general, spoke about this in particular in a Twitter thread a couple years back. He initially proposed Galactus as the main villain and final boss of Marvel 1, and while the dev team seemed to have no problem with it, Marvel, who'd been pretty lax with their roster choices up to that point, actually vetoed it, citing that Galactus isn't someone that could be easily beaten, let alone by anyone in the cast. Akitomo, flexing his Marvel knowledge, stood his ground, and actually shot back at Marvel by explicitly mentioning a time where Galactus was beaten by heroes in a physical confrontation, issue 243 of Fantastic Four, which saw the Fantastic Four take down Galactus with the help of the Avengers. He added that they'd even come up with a justification for Galactus even being able to be taken on by the cast. He'd be hungry, which might sound silly to non-comic book fans, but within the Marvel Universe itself, Galactus is canonically at his weakest when he hasn't consumed planets for a very long time. Even when given examples supporting Capcom's stance, Marvel still vetoed the idea in the end, with the team instead using Onslaught. Akitomo, who had left Capcom by the time Marvel vs Capcom 3 released, reflected that he was surprised to see Galactus as the game's final boss, given how much he tried to fight for him earlier in the series. I guess Marvel must have relaxed their stance. Though I find it kind of funny that they had a problem with Marvel and Capcom heroes beating Galactus, but someone like Spider-Man beating an Infinity Gauntlet-equipped Thanos and Marvel superheroes was a-okay. But hey, I'm just some guy and they're a huge corporation. They probably know better than me. This one I actually mentioned in a previous character analysis video, but I think it bears mentioning again here, since it's a really interesting character cut. Capcom vs SNK 2 has 3 Capcom character additions in particular that were a bit unexpected. Kyosuke from Rival Schools, Eagle from the first Street Fighter game, and Maki from Final Fight 2 in particular. Interviews with the development team indicated that they wanted some characters on both sides of the roster that would make fans of either company go, wow, I haven't seen them in a long time. Something that likely influenced the inclusion of Ryu Hakutoto, who to this day has only ever been playable in the first Art of Fighting game and CVS2 itself. Maki is the one we're going to focus on here, because as it turns out, Capcom originally had a different female beat-em-up protagonist in mind. According to the aforementioned interviews with the developers, the original plan was for Maki's roster spot to go to Lin Kurosawa, the protagonist of Capcom's 1995 Aliens vs Predator beat-em-up. Lin herself seemed to be a pretty popular character, not just among fans but Capcom staff as well, as she cameos in the backgrounds of a few Street Fighter stages, and Simone in Cannon Spike is a pretty obvious homage to Lin's character design and moveset. However, there's a reason that she was eventually relegated to easily missed background cameos and design send-ups, and it's the same reason why she couldn't be put into CVS too. Our good old friend, licensing issues. You see, Aliens vs Predator is a licensed game, one of many Capcom worked on in the 90s alongside stuff like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, the Marvel Fighters, and Spawn to name a few. Lin Kurosawa was an original character Capcom designed for the game, but because the IP itself is owned by Fox and now Disney, they own all original characters created for it too. It's very similar to how Sora is handled in Kingdom Hearts. Sora and all other original characters are designed by Square Enix, but are legally property of Disney alongside the Kingdom Hearts IP itself. The dev team wasn't entirely discouraged at first though. After realizing they couldn't use Lin directly, they quickly decided on Maki as a replacement, but floated along the idea that instead of having a moveset of her own, she would fight using a Lin-inspired set of abilities. Down the line, they realized they might be shortchanging Maki there, so they instead elected to give her a moveset based on her Final Fight 2 appearance. This cut kind of stings as a massive fan of Alien vs Predator, but it also illustrates a problem inherent to crossover games and even guest characters in fighting games. They're always going to be bound to whatever legalities that allowed them to exist in the first place, and those same legalities can stifle further appearances in other games, or even the distribution of the games themselves. I suppose that's the price to be paid for intercompany crossovers. Whether it's worth it or not in the end is probably a subject for a different video though. As I mentioned in the previous video, Tatsunoko vs Capcom had a laundry list of characters revealed by the developers themselves that were considered and eventually scrapped. What's particularly interesting about the list is that you can draw some conclusions based on characters that ended up making it to the game's eventual 2010 update, and Marvel vs Capcom 3, which had secretly begun development the same year that Tatsunoko vs Capcom originally released in arcades. You have characters like Arthur and Hashenko, who ended up being saved for Marvel 3, as well as Yatterman 2 and Joe the Condor, who eventually ended up in the aforementioned Ultimate All-Stars update. There's even characters on this shortlist where you can infer which characters were chosen over them instead. I think Princess Tiara from Gaia Master was more than likely passed up in favor of Saki, as they both hail from fairly obscure Japanese-only quiz and board games, Saki herself coming from Quiz Nairo Dreams. Zero Goki, a giant robot version of Akuma that appears as a Kanto-exclusive bonus character in the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn ports of Cyberbots, most likely lost out to PTX, who represents Lost Planet instead. But there's 2 characters on this list I find interesting, because they represent a roster niche that Tatsunoko vs Capcom completely ignores, perhaps intentionally so. Mirai King Boss of the Neo-Human Kashan series, and M. Bison from Street Fighter. Bison isn't a stranger to the Versus games, having been in 3 Marvel Versus games, as well as both Capcom vs SNK games. Mirai King Boss is where it gets interesting though, as it only highlights that there are very few, if any, villains in the game at all. Doronjo is the closest you get, and she's generally a comic relief villain at that. Moreover, what would have made this duo even more interesting is the fact that Bison's character design is directly inspired by Breaking Boss himself. In previous videos, I've mentioned that the influence Tatsunoko had on Capcom games existed long before they'd eventually cross over. Breaking Boss in particular seemed to be the direct visual inspiration behind not just Bison, but Sigma from the Mega Man X series as well. The latter really isn't a surprise at all, given how much influence Kashan as a whole had on the Mega Man series. So, why exactly were they cut? We'll probably never know for sure, but when talking about the decision to include Batsu as the rival school's character in the game over Hinata, the game's producer Ryota Niitsuma related that the dev team wanted to specifically focus on the protagonists of series represented in the game to better fit the game's subtitle of cross-generation of heroes. There are some small exceptions though, like Ro and Doronjo, the former because there was already a main Mega Man on the roster, and the latter because she's far too iconic to leave out regardless of her affiliation. And that reasoning kind of checks out. You might have noticed that Ibuki was on the short list of considered characters as well, but Alex ended up being the Street Fighter character representing 3, and we all know that Alex was meant to be the main character of that game. Still, it's a shame. Bison had kind of a theme of forming a big bad duo with characters in opposing companies in prior Versus games, like with Magneto in X-Men vs Street Fighter and Geese in Capcom vs SNK. Funnily enough, the other Breaking Boss inspired character I mentioned earlier, Sigma, would go on to form the basis of one of these Versus series duos, appearing and eventually fusing with Marvel supervillain Ultron in Marvel vs Capcom Infinite. Marvel vs Capcom 3, like Tatsunoko vs Capcom directly before it, also has a bunch of characters that were considered but eventually scrapped for the game. Two that stung particularly for me were Fo Lu and Nina from the Breath of Fire series. Fo Lu is the deuteragonist and eventual antagonist of Breath of Fire 4, while Nina herself is kind of a recurring character in the Breath of Fire games. There's different incarnations of her in each game, so to speak, though the ones in the second and third games are descendants of the first one. It's somewhat similar to how Princess Zelda is handled in the Legend of Zelda series. For Nina in particular, this would have played into how her moveset would have been designed. According to MvC3 Producer Ryota Niitsuma, the plan was to have her be visually based on her incarnation in the first Breath of Fire game, but having her use spells from across the entire series, as Nina was almost always her respective game's dedicated black mage. Her level 3 would have seen her summoning all of her incarnations from the other 4 games for one big team-up attack, something the Smash Bros. Dev team would later do for Mega Man and Smash Bros. Fo Lu was cut because the development team wasn't confident that players outside of Japan would even recognize him. That didn't stop characters in the past in similar positions like Jin from becoming popular, but whatever. Nina, on the other hand, was one of the characters considered for the game's ultimate release in late 2011, and according to Niitsuma, one of the very last roster cuts made before the additional roster inclusions were finalized. As a massive fan of the series, and particularly someone whom Breath of Fire 3 in particular had a massive impact on in their formative years, it really stings knowing we were this close to finally getting some representation. I mean, Lost Planet and San got series representation before Breath of Fire. How fucked up is that? Now, this was going to be the end of the video at one point in time, but during the scripting process, some interesting developments unfolded regarding 2 characters we were told were cut pretty late into development for Vanilla Marvel 3. Frank West and the Spider-Man villain Dr. Octopus. Frank is an interesting one. He would have been another returning character from Tatsunoko vs Capcom's console ports, following Beautiful Joe and Zero, and Frank was still in play long enough that not only did he appear as a silhouette in a good chunk of Marvel 3 promo material, but he was also confirmed to be the obscured helicopter pilot in the Episode 2 CG trailer for the game. In the case of Doc Ock, he apparently was cut pretty far into development as well. Work had started on him, a moveset was designed, and according to Niitsuma, even had a theme song composed and ready to go as well. Unfortunately though, the reason both characters ended up being cut likely came down to technical issues. Doc Ock's trademark tentacles apparently occupied its own character slot in the game's internal data separate from him, and I'd have to imagine programming those tentacles likely led to a lot of issues and bugs. As for Frank, his exclusion from Vanilla Marvel 3 was officially confirmed before both characters' names were eventually data mined from the game's disk in early 2011. Niitsuma cited that they ran into some issues with Frank that necessitated some extra work being done on him, and in the end, they decided to divert resources elsewhere. My guess being towards Shuma and Joe, who are partially in the disc data for Vanilla Marvel 3, but not finished enough to be anywhere near playable, especially Joe. And for the longest time, this was all we had on the matter. Not too long ago, a pre-release build of the Xbox 360 version of Vanilla Marvel 3 surfaced, and modders data mined it to see if there was anything interesting in this build. As it turns out, this build ended up containing the first and to this day only visual assets we've seen for Doc Ock and Frank in Marvel 3. Yeah, Frank eventually got in the Ultimate, but it's still worth noting. That said, Doc Ock is the real interesting find though, as it confirms a few things. We know he was far enough in development that he had life bar art and text made for him, and moreover, we know now from the small life bar picture we have that his design would have likely been based on his classic green and yellow-orange design, since we can see the neckline sporting the latter colors. Who knows if an earlier build may show up with him in the playable state, but I think it's really cool to get some kind of visual evidence of his presence in the game beyond unscrubbed text strings. That's going to do it for this video. I want to thank everyone for watching, like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll catch you next video. Take care.